On November 2nd, 2016, a somewhat frantic call was placed to 911 in Redding, California. The caller's name was Keith Papini, and he stated that after coming home to an empty house that should have been filled with his wife and children, he tracked his wife's phone down to a grassy area at the end of the block where it sat abandoned with the headphones still attached. And in those headphones, he found strands of blonde hair that looked like his wife's that had been ripped from her head. In spite of the odds, 3 weeks later, this woman was found wandering 150 miles from her home, emaciated and with a story of kidnapping and torture. But investigators don't believe her. And over the next several years, the two sides would battle it out over what was the truth. Was she kidnapped? Was this a hoax? This is the story of Sharri Papini. Hi, my name is Tasha, and this is my series White Rabbit, the podcast version, where we deep dive into anything spooky, odd, or just interesting. So this is my first White Rabbit podcast episode. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know that my White Rabbit series is a story, but also accompanied with some special effects makeup, some body paint, some kind of look that I'm doing. But a lot of times I come across stories that I really want to talk about, but either I can't think of a makeup look to do with it, or I just don't think it's appropriate. I don't want to do a makeup look with it, but sometimes I still want to talk about them. So this is a new series. I really would love your opinion. So after you watch this episode, let me know what you think in the comments. If you want more of these, less of these. I really want to make these videos a lot longer, so I'll probably have at least 2 to 3 different stories on like the same episode for the podcast. Please remember to like and subscribe if you like this type of content and you want to see more of my face. So I'm going to do a really quick life update because I know I haven't been here in a while. I think it's been over a month since I've recorded, but so much has been happening. So if you've noticed, I have a cat tree behind me. And that is because I became a cat mom. No one saw this coming, not even me, because I've always been a dog person, but I have been thinking about it for quite a while, maybe a couple of years now. I finally made the plunge and I got 2 little kitties. Luna disappeared for like 8 hours. We ended up finding her. She crawled under a cabinet in the bathroom, a little bitty tiny crack that we just did not think that she could fit through. She got through. Look at her. Oh, she getting out now. Oh, she looking in the room like that. And they didn't get along for like the first week that we had them, so we were kind of nervous. We had to keep them separated. There was a lot of hissing, a lot of slapping of paws. Fight! 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 Luckily, after about a week, they just basically fell in love and they're best friends now. They sleep together, they eat together, they're always together. So I'm so happy for that. Aside from that, I also started training for a 5K and it is very hard. It's too hard. It's kind of intense for me, honestly. It's very intense for me. But I'm having a great time doing the hard things, so I'm really excited about it. I actually can't wait to get to it. So that's the reason I have been gone for so long. I've really been trying to learn how to juggle everything and stay on schedule. It has not been going good, but I'm happy to be back. I'm excited to share these stories, so let's go ahead and jump right into our first story. Sharri Papini was born Sharri Garef on June 11th, 1982 in Shasta County, California. Her parents are Richard and Laura Garef, and she also has a sister named Sheila. Sharri and her sister did not have a happy childhood at all. They dealt with a lot of trauma in their household, and most of this had to do with all of the drugs and alcohol that they were surrounded by. Just to give you an example of some of the things that Sharri and her sister had to endure, one of Sharri's friends said that she was over Sharri's house one day and her mother, out of nowhere, burst into the room screaming, cursing at Sharri, grabbed her by the hair, dragged her down the hall while beating her and screaming for her friend to go home. Sharri was crying and screaming. Her friend probably thought she was about to get killed. I have actually experienced that more than once. I've seen a couple of my friends get beat down by their parents. Awkward. And it's traumatic for everyone. So I can just imagine the trauma that not only Sharri had, but her friend had from that event. And Sharri went through things like this all of the time. To Sharri, this is just the way that her mom was. But by the time Sharri was 16, she had enough of her mom. She dropped out of school, packed her bags, and ran off to LA, where she basically was sleeping on the couch of anyone that she could. All she knew was that she didn't want to be home with her mother, but she had no idea how she was going to make this work. In 2009, Sharri went to a gathering at one of her friends' houses where she met who would eventually become her husband. His name was Keith Papini. Keith and Sharri hit it off instantly. According to him, it was love at first sight. They had their first date off of a little lake, and he was so in love with her instantly. He was just amazed at how vibrant and fun and beautiful she was. Let's say hi to everybody. Say hello. This is Luna. Are you gonna look at them? No. So yeah, Sharri was absolutely beautiful. She was blonde with big blue eyes and this wide smile. And then she had this infectious laugh that just everyone loved. Sharri was attracted to Keith's warm demeanor. He seemed loving and caring, like he was a real family man. And that's what Sharri wanted. She was ready to have a family with someone who would be a good husband and a good father. But soon after meeting Sharri, Keith was hit with a curveball. On their very first date, Sharri told Keith that she was married, and she was very matter-of-fact about it, like it was no big deal. She said the only reason that they got married was because he was a member of the military and he could get more money if he were married, and that she needed to use his medical benefits so that she could get heart surgery. So it was presented to Keith more as like a business deal. Sharri had gotten married in 2006 to a man named David Dreyfus. And like most of her relationships, this marriage was very short-lived. Sharri's sister recalled at this time that Sharri had really low standards, so she basically stopped bringing her boyfriends home because her family would always be disapproving of it. So she didn't want to hear it, and they really didn't want to meet them. Her family would be outwardly disapproving, especially her sister Sheila. Sheila did not hold back on what she thought about Sharri's boyfriends. But when Sharri met Keith, it was pretty different. It seemed like the two doted on each other. They were so in love and so obsessed with each other. Sharri would always tell her friends about how loving and affectionate and sweet Keith was. The two were always taking pictures, always traveling. They just appeared to be very in love. Sharri even described Keith to her family as her knight in shining armor. That he had come and swept her off of her feet, and he was just this amazing man. The two got married in October of 2009, and they ended up having 2 children together. A son named Tyler and a daughter named Violet. Now, Sharri was described as this awesome mom. The most common term used when referring to Sharri about like her parenting was supermom. Everyone called her supermom. She was really devoted and involved with her children. She never hesitated to host a party or an event. She spent her days doing arts and crafts and smothering her children with the attention that she never got from her mother. It really seemed like her parenting couldn't be further away from the way that she was parented. She was always with her children, and they came first. And this is what made the events of November 2nd, 2016 even more scary to Sharri's family and her friends. This day started pretty normal initially. Keith was at work and the kids were at daycare. At around 10:37 a.m., Keith received a text message from Sharri just asking if he was going to be home for lunch that day. I think it was a little freaky text. Sharri wanted to do a little something, but Keith could not get away, so he told her that he wouldn't be home. But that was pretty much it. Keith didn't hear from Sharri anymore after that point. Later that night at around 5 p.m. when Keith got home, he thought it was strange that no one was there. Sharri would be there by now. The kids should be home from daycare by now. Normally, there would be a house full of voices, but the house was extremely quiet. So Keith thought, okay, she's probably on a walk with the kids. So he grabs his keys, hops in his car, and he drives around the neighborhood looking for them. He doesn't see them, so he goes back home and he decides to call the daycare. Now, when Keith called the daycare and they told him that the children had never been picked up, he immediately got worried. because Sharri Supermom Papini would never be late to pick her kids up. And if by some chance she was going to be late, she would have called. This was very unusual. So Keith decides to check her location on the Find My Phone feature. And when he did that, he found that her phone was basically on the same block, but just further down at the end of the block. So he hops back in his car, goes to the end of the block, and he finds Sharri's phone just in a patch of grass, headphones still attached, and in those headphones is a lot of hair that looks like it's Sharri's and it looks like it's been ripped from her head. Keith was obviously freaked out, and he knew at this point it was time to call 911. Investigators arrived on the scene and pretty much took this very, very seriously immediately. I mean, the ripped hair attached to the headphones pretty much says that she did not leave of her own free will. Officers went to go search the house, and when they did, they found hundreds and hundreds of dollars there. That was very concerning because when people disappear on their own, they normally take cash, especially if they don't want to be tracked by credit card, debit card, anything like that. They wouldn't leave tons of cash just sitting in the house. This was reeking of foul play, and police pulled out every trick they had to try to locate Sharri. There were officers on ground the entire night looking for her. There were police dogs and helicopters. Sharri Papini was dominating the news, and partially because she fit this certain aesthetic, right? She was young, beautiful, a mom, blonde, big smile. And she disappeared doing something very normal. She was just going for a run. So people were really resonating with her and her story. But there was another reason why Sharri's disappearance was front and center. And this is because Sharri Papini disappeared inside of what is called the Emerald Triangle. If you haven't heard about the Emerald Triangle like I hadn't, I did the Googling for both of us. So the Emerald Triangle consists of 3 counties that form a triangle inside of California. The counties are Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity County. This area is very mountainous. It's really rough terrain out there, but supposedly this type of terrain is really, really good for growing weed.
Everyone likes smoking weed.
Weed farms flourish in this area. And even though marijuana has been legalized in California for quite some time now, the profits are still higher in illegal growing. Because of this, it became very common for drifters to kind of come in and out, floating as workers at the pot farms. But when you mix drugs, illegal activities, and outsiders constantly passing through, you do get a lot of crime. And there is a ton of crime inside the Emerald Triangle. Police started a little closer to home, and they started canvassing the neighborhood, asking neighbors not only if they had seen anything, heard anything strange, but they also were asking about the relationship between Sharri and Keith. And I mean, this is normal for a missing woman. Investigators are always going to dig into the close personal relationships. The neighbors reported that it was a pretty regular occurrence for them to hear yelling and screaming coming from the Papini household. One neighbor in particular stated that about a week before Sharri's disappearance, she heard Keith screaming that he was going to, quote, freaking kill her. That same neighbor said that when she heard about Sharri's disappearance, the first thing that she thought about was, oh my God, what did Keith do to her? Some of the words used to describe Keith were weird, creepy, and an asshole. And of course, none of these make him a murderer, but it did make police kind of raise an eyebrow at Keith, especially when Sharri's friend Jennifer told investigators that at a dinner they had together, Sharri told her that Keith said if she ever tried to leave him, that she would be cut into pieces and scattered in the backyard. Jennifer did make an important interjection though, and she said that her friend Sharri is very known for being dramatic. And personally, Jennifer had never seen that side of Keith, so she didn't know if Keith was just really good at keeping that side at home. Several of Sharri's friends said that Keith was very protective over Sharri, but they described it more in a possessive type of way. He was too protective. Sharri wasn't even allowed to have Facebook because Keith said that he didn't want anyone to look at her. According to Sharri, that's important. Also, Keith did not like when Sharri went out with her friends. He just did not seem to trust her. There was even one time that Sharri had some type of conference where she went out of town, and Keith surprised her by just popping up out of state at the conference.
What the hell are you doing here?
It was pretty obvious to everyone there that this was not some kind of surprise, that he was just keeping tabs on her, and it was just really weird. But when you start to understand a little bit more about Sharri and about the dynamic of their relationship, it makes a little more sense. According to just about everybody in Sharri's life, they say that Sharri was very, very popular amongst men. They also say that this did not change once she got married. Sharri entertained many, many men while she was married to Keith, and of course this put a strain on their relationship, as it would with anyone's. I don't think the cure is to just pop up when she has out-of-town conventions, but he didn't know what to do, clearly. Keith and Sharri often fought over her talking to other men, and during one of these fights, Sharri even took a picture frame and split open Keith's knee. Of course, investigators wanted to talk to Keith about this, so they brought him in for questioning, and he was very cooperative. He seemed understanding. He knew that the police would need to talk to him, and he understood why they needed to talk to him. He did seem a bit nervous, but who wouldn't be nervous under these circumstances? And I don't know if investigators were telling him what people said about him, but it's like, what a way to find out that you're not the cool guy you thought you were, and that people kind of think you're an asshole, and maybe that you murdered your wife. But there wasn't really anything solid connecting Keith to Sharri's disappearance. Like, sure, he wasn't everybody's cup of tea, but most things could be explained away by normal marital disputes. And even the people who didn't really care for Keith said that they never saw him angry and they never saw him abusive. Police were a little torn about what they felt about Keith, and part of this was because of the way that this picture of who Sharri was starting to unfold. The best way I can explain this is with an example. Okay, so you know how Sharri's best friend said that she was known for being like really dramatic and exaggerating? Keep that up there. So investigators were talking to Sharri's friend Nicole, and Nicole said that one day she saw Sharri and Sharri's face was just like so bruised. She had a black eye, she was bruised around her face, and of course she asked Sharri what happened. So Sharri told Nicole that when they were over, by they I mean Sharri and Keith, they were over their friend's house, and Keith got really mad at Sharri and they got into a little dispute, a little argument, and he punched her in the face in front of everyone. This immediately grabs the attention of the investigators and they bring it up to Keith. According to Keith, he and Sharri were at their friend Ryan and Lauren's apartment. And while they were there, they were playing the Wii. And if you've ever played the Wii, or like Wii Sports specifically, you know how intense that can get, right? So they were playing Ninja Slice on the Wii, and Keith was really into it, and he went to like slice this fruit and he punched her in the face. He hit her so hard in the face, and it was just an accident, and it happened in front of their friend. So he said that Ryan and Lauren could confirm that that was really what happened, and he doesn't know why Sharri would say that he punched her in a fight. Obviously, police are going to want to confirm this story, so they go directly to Ryan and Lauren and they ask them what happened. And surprisingly to investigators, Ryan and Lauren confirmed that what Keith said was the absolute truth. They didn't know why Sharri would say that he punched her in the face. It was an accident. It happened during a really intense Wii game. So now investigators are thinking, why would she lie like that? Being dramatic is one thing, but when you're so dramatic to the point that you're completely twisting the truth, then that's just a plain old lie. You're a liar. You're not being dramatic. And this is just one example that shows how Sharri really had a problem with honesty. She really had a problem with lying. This made it really difficult to do victimology on her because depending on who you asked, Sharri was a different person. Depending on who you asked, she portrayed Keith as a different person. She portrayed a
girl, what now?
Their relationship different ways, so they didn't really know what was true. Some friends said her husband was this knight in shining armor. Some people said that he was a controlling, abusive man. Some people said Sharri was this strong, powerful, equal person in this relationship, and others said that she was there just to serve Keith. So they've got nothing. The picture of who Sahrri Papini was still very fuzzy, but the media had this story front and center. There was a ton of coverage. Her very pregnant sister was on television begging for her return, pleading for no one to hurt her. Keith looked like he was on the border of a mental collapse at pretty much all times. He did not look like he was holding it together well. And the public was responding. There were hundreds of volunteers that showed up to help look for Sharri. They were handing out flyers. Local businesses printed hundreds and hundreds of these flyers for free just so that everyone could hand them out. The community was desperate to get Sharri home to her children. And investigators were just as desperate. So they start combing through her phone because they just want any information on what could have possibly happened to her. They're at zero. In doing so, they found out that Sharri had recently had contact with two men. One of these men was from Michigan. His name was Donovan, but honestly, it took me so long to find his name that I called him Mr. Michigan through like half of the script before I found it. So we're gonna stick with Mr. Michigan. I like it. I'm attached. Mr. Michigan met Sharri in Lansing, Illinois in 2011. I believe they were at some type of like work conference. And despite Sharri being very married to Keith at the time, she and Mr. Michigan had what he said was, quote, a wonderful night together. She had left the next morning, but apparently they had developed such a connection that 5 years later, they were still in contact. Mr. Michigan said that according to Sharri, her husband was this vile, abusive man that refused to let her have a life of her own. He was just very controlling. This moment kind of made me raise an eyebrow because you're talking to a man that you met at a work conference when you were away from your husband, and you had enough freedom to have a 5-year affair or at bare minimum inappropriate relationship with this man. So I would say you have at least some freedom. And I'm not saying that that means she can't be abused. I'm just saying that it's unlikely that he has you locked away in a room. She was literally traveling for her career. Keith did find out about this affair and he was very upset. I mean, Sharri was having this fictional romance via text with this man for years. He was pretty ashamed of the way his wife was acting, but at the end of the day, they both decided that they wanted to try to make it work and they wanted to keep their family together. Little did Keith know, Sharri kept in contact with Mr. Michigan all the way up until the point of her disappearance. It wasn't as intense as it was when they first met, but still random check-ins with a man that you had an affair with, that your husband found out about and specifically asked you not to contact. It's shady. November 1st, the day before her disappearance, Sharri texted Mr. Michigan and she asked him to meet up. He had a business meeting with a layover in San Francisco and he was going to be there for quite a few hours. So he originally invited her to meet up, but she declined because she already had plans that day. Well, when the day came, her plans changed, her friend canceled, so now she had some time to meet up with him. The vibe of the text messages was pretty flirtatious, but at the end, they didn't end up meeting up because it just wasn't like good for both of their schedules. He had already booked an earlier flight out when he thought that he wouldn't be seeing her, so it didn't work. As we know, Sharri went missing the very next day. One of the worst parts about this was that Keith had no idea what was going on. He did not know that Sharri was still talking to Mr. Michigan. Investigators were telling him that not only was your wife planning to meet up and have sex with this guy, but from the looks of it, it seems as if they have like a real relationship going on. They're talking like they want to be together. Mr. Michigan did say that all of this was just a fantasy. He and Sharri had created this fantasy life together via text, but neither one of them really took it too seriously or made any moves to like solidify what they were talking about. But that doesn't matter to Keith because even though it's a fantasy life, his wife is creating a fantasy life with a man that she had an affair with that he thought she wasn't talking to anymore. Because of what they were beginning to uncover, investigators started to question if Sharri had really been kidnapped. Keith doesn't really have time to truly take this in or react because she's still missing. He's searching for her along with the rest of the world. But that search would come to an end Thanksgiving Day when a 911 call would come through stating that there was a woman on the side of the road in chains screaming that she needed help. The woman in chains got on the phone and she told the operator that her name was Sharri Papini and that she had been kidnapped. Sharri was found about 150 miles away from her home. She looked terrible, honestly. She was emaciated. She was bruised. Her hair had been chopped off. She was pale. She looked like a ghost of her past self. So investigators immediately want to talk to her, of course. They want to find out where she's been, what happened, who took her. But Sharri is refusing to talk to any of them. She repeatedly asked for her husband and she told the officers, this was recorded, "No one can protect me. I want my husband. No one found me. I want my husband." Investigators realized that they aren't going to get anywhere with her, so they gave in and they let Keith come to see her. In an interview afterwards, investigators and Keith both said that as soon as they saw Sharri and they saw how bruised and battered, she had like a hole in her hand, it was crazy. When they saw her, they immediately knew she had in fact been kidnapped. This was no faking. Sharri was bawling her eyes out. You couldn't understand half of what she was saying. I mean, I listened to a recording, so maybe in person it was different, but she seemed pretty incoherent. Sharri did eventually calm down enough to have a very brief conversation with the police where she said that the police were involved and that she did not want to talk to them. Sharri then said she read me articles and she said that they don't believe me. They think I left voluntarily, but I didn't. She also kept saying one of them is involved. So investigators have a talk with Keith and they're like, look, you have got to get something out of her. We need to find out who this was. And Keith agreed, because if there's someone out there that's capable of doing what was done to Sharri, he wanted them to be caught and he wanted to know who they were. So Keith turns to Sharri and he's like, look, I'm not leaving you, but we have to figure this out. Pretend you're not talking to them. You're just talking to me. Tell me what happened. And Sharri did resist a little at first, but eventually she gave in and she started to talk a little. Sharri told investigators that a dark-colored SUV approached her with two Hispanic women inside. And then she started having some kind of breakdown and all she kept repeating was, something went wrong. They said if I didn't struggle, I could go home, but something went wrong. Something went wrong. At this point, Keith shut down the interview because realistically, they're not getting anywhere. Sharri was severely distraught, so for the time being, they just put a halt on all the questioning. The investigators left knowing little to nothing, but 4 days later, on November 28th, they sat down with Sharri and Keith for a formal interview. They wanted to interview Sharri on her own, but there was no way she would let that happen. She made it very clear that the only way she would interview was if Keith could be by her side. So investigators felt like this is the only way that they were going to get to talk to her. She did not trust the police and she did not want to be alone with them. With her husband there, even though she was reluctant, she began to open up to investigators, and this was her story. On the day that she went missing, Sharri said that she did go out for a jog. While she was on her jog, she noticed a dark SUV pass her, stop, and then reverse. In this SUV were two Hispanic women, and one of those women shouted out something to Sharri. She thought she was asking for directions, so she stopped. It was at this time that the woman pulled a gun from her purse and pointed it at Sharri. I felt like I said that weird. She grabbed a gun from her purse and pointed it at Sharri. Then the woman said either I don't want to have to hurt you or I don't want to have to kill you. Sharri really couldn't remember which one. Sharri then got inside onto the floor of the SUV and these two women took her somewhere. She didn't know where. Sorry if the lighting changed. I had to stop for a while and it's super dark outside now, so there's that. Unfortunately for investigators, there were some huge chunks missing out of Sharri's story that would really be beneficial to helping solve this case. One of these missing chunks was about the ride to wherever she was taken. Sharri couldn't remember anything. She couldn't remember how long the ride was. She couldn't remember which direction the SUV approached her. She said that she couldn't even remember stepping into the SUV. But Sharri did remember really random things, like she remembered the smell of fabric softener when a pillowcase was thrown over her head. She said that she was on the floor for most of the ride, but she didn't really know how long that ride was. And although there was a pillowcase over her head that smelled like fabric softener, Sharri could still smell the car floor, and she said that it smelled disgusting. Sharri also said that they played mariachi music the entire way. Sharri's release was just as confusing as her capture. Sharri said that there was some arguing with the two women that had kidnapped her. There was one older woman and there was a younger woman. In this argument, the younger woman was stating that Sharri really needed medicine or she needed to be taken to a hospital. The older woman was saying absolutely not. She does not need medicine. She's fine. We cannot take her to the hospital. So they had this big blowout fight. And after this fight, the younger woman came in, she got Sharri and took her to the van, dropped her off on the side of the road and clipped her restraints. Sharri was taken, tortured, and then just released with no explanation, no reason. For weeks after Sharri's return, she could remember close to nothing about her kidnapping. It became very obvious to everyone that she needed some therapy. Her therapist suggested that Sharri write about her captivity as if she were writing a book. And even though she didn't remember a lot, just write down everything that she could remember and maybe it would unlock more memories. And then she could piece together with the police exactly what happened. Sharri did exactly that, and the title of her book was 22 Days. In 22 Days, Sharri recalled that she dealt with two different women. One of them, a younger woman, and another older woman that was very cruel. The older woman would beat Sharri. She would have violent outbursts, deny her food and water. This older woman was the reason that Sharri had all of the bruises that she did have. The older woman is how Sharri obtained every single one of her injuries. This woman was prone to violent outbursts where she would just beat Sharri half to death, and Sharri said that she refused to let her bathe. This older woman seemed to really enjoy the torture. It was very different from the younger woman. The younger woman seemed more like almost an unwilling participant, but she was participating. Specifically, the branding of Sharri. Sharri had a really nasty brand that was over her shoulder and it was crusted and bleeding when they found her. Well, the little one, as Sharri called her, was handling the branding tools during that whole process. I'm assuming when she says branding tools, she means like an iron, like a hot iron. When Sharri was interviewed by investigators, she just gave like bits and pieces of the story. But in the book 22 Days, Sharri went into excruciating detail. I mean, she talked about the way her skin sounded when it was sizzling and melting off. She talked about the smell of it. It was crazy descriptive. During this branding session is when the woman told Sharri that no one was going to be able to help her because the person behind all of this, the mastermind, was actually a cop. Sharri was really doing her best to cooperate with the police, even though she was very afraid. She was trying to be really open to everything her therapist told her to try. Still, Sharri was having a really hard time adjusting back to normal life. I struggle to say normal because there was a media circus at this time, but her family did go into relative seclusion in order to have as much normalcy as they could. Sharri, however, had a lot of triggers. And a lot of them were anything involving the Hispanic culture. I mean, Sharri couldn't even look at black beans without freaking out. I saw a video of her trying to eat taco sauce and no comment. Sharri was triggered by anybody that looked like they could possibly maybe be Hispanic. She didn't like anyone with dark curly hair. Sharri was also triggered by any loud noises or any doors being closed, which that makes total sense. What, sugar booger? Sharri could only eat food that her sister or her husband had prepared, and she had to watch them prepare it because she was drugged so many times during her captivity, and they would always put the drugs in her food. So needless to say, she had a lot of issues that she needed to work through. And her family needed to heal too. Everyone was affected by her kidnapping, and Sharri was not doing a good job keeping it together. She was known to have really bad breakdowns, and she would even have them in front of her children. Keith would really encourage her to like go in another room because he wanted to shield the children from that as much as possible. But then Sharri would be offended, I guess, that he was asking her to take that in another room. I don't know. I guess I could see I'm on his side. Their mom was already missing for like 22 days. They didn't know what was going on. They're living through a media circus. Their whole world is turned upside down. I do think that you should be able to at least go into another room. But Sharri would get really upset and tell him that she can't control her triggers, she can't control her reactions, and he should just accept that. Keith was really just doing the best that he could at this time. The relationships that Keith and Sharri had with their friends was forever changed because they were forever changed. They did attempt at keeping their friendship alive even though it had changed. But in this attempt to keep their friendship alive, something really weird happened. When Sharri started feeling comfortable enough to be around people again, Keith and Sharri invited over like 15 of their closest friends. By Sharri's request, every single one of them went through where they were, what they were doing, what their reaction was when they found out that she was still alive. Not only did she want really emotional, in-depth details, but she wanted them to tell it to the entire group. Like everybody was kind of put on the spot. I'm sure Sharri knew that most of them thought that she would not be found alive. Normally, a woman kidnapped under those circumstances and missing for that long, typically you would be finding a body. She was missing for 22 days. Two of their friends had actually captured their reaction on their Ring doorbell footage, and Sharri wanted everybody to watch this together. So they did, and it was a very emotional moment and a beautiful moment. But also, why are you doing this? So after that, Sharri wanted to share details about the kidnapping with her friends because she felt like they deserved to have answers to certain questions. Months and months had passed by and there were still so many gaps in Sharri's story and people just did not understand why. Like, why can you vividly remember some details, but other details you have no idea about? And the details that you can remember don't really help the case, and all the details that would help the case you can't remember. So she explained to them that the reason that her memory was so patchy was because she was drugged so much. When Keith talked about this memory, he did say that it was a very beautiful and touching moment, but he also said that he just knew something was off. Something just felt weird about it. And he could not shake the feeling. He just felt like Sharri was not telling the truth about something. He wanted to believe his wife, but also he knew that she was a liar. He didn't know if she was lying about this, but he felt like there were some details that she was lying about. And Sharri had lied a lot to him in the past, and sometimes she lied about very serious things. Okay, so for example, Sharri has these two prominent scars on her back. There's one on each side. It's about halfway down, like if you were to picture where angel wings would be placed on your back, like right there. So of course Keith had asked her at one point, like, what happened there? What happened? And Sharri told him that she had this really psycho crazy ex and they got into an argument one time and he took two knives and just like jammed them into her back. But Sharri had forgotten that she had told their very close friend Jennifer a completely different story about those same scars. She had told Jennifer that her father had pinned her down and stabbed her in the back. Come to find out, she did it to herself. I don't know how, but she admitted to one of her friends that she did it to herself. So Keith knew that she would lie about a serious situation. But because of the severity of Sharri's injuries, he basically just put all of that to the side, all of his questions aside, and he really wanted to focus on healing her and healing their family. Between Sharri, Keith, and their therapist, it was decided that Sharri would take shoe boxes and she would take her book 22 Days and recreate the room that she was held captive in. And the reason they wanted to do this was because Sharri actually knew a lot of details about that room. Sharri said that there was one small window with 3 boards drilled into the wall going horizontal across the window. There was a small trash can that was her toilet. Sharri also had a chain around her waist that was fastened to a cable, and then that cable was attached to a pole in the closet. She described a marble gray coffee table that was inside of the room with her, And Keith actually got online with Sharri and went through coffee table after coffee table after coffee table until she finally picked one out and said, yes, this is the table that was in the room. So piece by piece, the clues were coming in. At this point, investigators decided that Sharri would work with a sketch artist so that they could get a better idea of what these two Hispanic women looked like. So Sharri did, and in turn, they released these sketches to the public. Investigators wanted other women to be aware that these two people were out there in case they came across them, but they also wanted to know if anybody recognized them. So there's a little interesting history with Sharri and Hispanic women. Some internet sleuth out there uncovered an article, and it was written by Sharri Garef, her maiden name. And this entire article was about how Sharri had gotten into this fight with these two Hispanic women and how she had broken the nose of one of them. She then goes on to talk about how proud her dad was of her and how she will always stand up for the white race. And this article was on like a super racist website. So this was interesting, not only the racist vibes, but the fact that two Hispanic women were once again the star of her story. Sharri outright denied that she wrote this article. When the investigators asked her how it got published under her first and last name, she had no explanation. There is a picture of her next to the article, and she just would not admit to it. It made no sense. She made no sense. A lot of her story made no sense. And slowly but surely, the community and the media started to turn on her. There was article after article after article questioning if this was a real kidnapping or if this was a hoax. Even the sketches that were released were criticized because they looked so plain and basic that they could have been like anybody. Sharri was giving the officers details bit by bit, but eventually all of these little bits were still not adding up. This was taking years to investigate, and I do mean years. It took investigators 3 years to get the first clue about the Sahrri Papini kidnapping. It was worth it. The clue was shocking. So, Sharri and Keith are sitting at home one day and they get a call from the FBI to come down for an interview. The FBI had finally gotten a DNA hit. And not only did they get a DNA hit, but they went out to visit this guy and they came back with pictures. The first thing and the most notable thing in my opinion that they showed her pictures of was this closet. Sharri had described in detail to the investigators what this closet looked like that she was tied to. There was a vertical pole called an all-thread pipe, and it went through the first 3 shelves of the closet, and then there was like an open space on the bottom. Supposedly it's just not a common closet. Like, you don't see things like that. And they're showing her a picture of exactly what she described. You can look at her shoebox and look at the pictures that the investigators are showing, and it's the same. But Sharri's reaction is not what you expect. Keith is sitting there and he's like, oh my God, this is the closet. And Sharri is just quiet. Then she says, it's a bit different, but it's really similar. Then investigators show Sharri this picture that this man that they got the DNA hit on, he had posted it on his Facebook, and they asked her if anything looked familiar. Once again, she was super quiet, but then Keith jumps up and he's like, the table, look at that table. That's the same coffee table that we picked out online. Then she said, oh yeah, that was the coffee table. That is the same coffee table. But they just showed you a picture of this coffee table that you described in detail that you picked out online, and you said nothing looked familiar. At this point, investigators started to be a little more upfront with Sharri. They told her that we know this is where you were, 100%. They also told her that they interviewed this man and that he gave them very specific details. Then they asked her, do you want to continue this interview? Sharri sits there looking like she's frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. And then she turns and looks at Keith and she's like, do you want to stay or do you want to leave the room? So obviously he wants to stay, and he told her that. Obviously, I want to stay. So Sharri asked the investigators if she could have a few moments with Keith alone before they started the interview, and so they stepped out. During this time alone, Sharri was scrambling a little bit, and she turns to Keith and tells Keith that she does not want to talk to the officers because she does not want them to find this younger woman. Sharri said that she had saved her life and she felt like she was indebted to her. You can watch the conversation between these two online and it is super tense. Sharri is basically pleading with Keith as if he has any control over what's happening right now. And she's telling him essentially that she does not want to cooperate with the police. Then Sharri tells Keith that she can tell by the way the police are talking to her that there's something going on. He's utterly confused at this point and he tells her, "You're not making sense to me to the point where I'm scared and you need to tell me what's going on." Before they could get any further, the investigators come back into the room. And this was tactical because they could hear Sharri saying that she didn't want to cooperate because she didn't want this woman to get in trouble. So they come back into the room and they tell her that this woman will get into no trouble if you just are honest with us. So now they've taken away her excuse of not cooperating because she didn't want this woman to get in trouble. Then they tell her, look, we know where the DNA came from. We know it came from James Reyes and we have his side of the story. Sharri starts immediately crying and saying there's no way it could be James. There's no way that it was him, even though investigators are telling her that they have his DNA. But according to Sharri, James would never do this because, plot twist, he's in love with her. James had started dating Sharri in 2003 and they dated for about 3 years. I don't know why they ended up breaking up, but they did end up breaking up. They reconnected in 2015. They were rekindling their romance over burner phone because obviously Sharri did not want Keith to know that she was texting other men. According to James, Sharri talked a lot about her husband. She talked about how he was physically abusive, that he sexually abused her, and that she just wanted to get away from him. So she had James so convinced that Keith was abusive that he agreed to help her. According to James, Sharri sent him a care package with instructions on where to meet her, and he did. He went and rented a car, picked her up. He drove by himself. There were no Hispanic women. James then met Sharri at the designated spot. She voluntarily got into his rental car and she stayed hidden for most of the 8 to 10 hour drive back to his home. He was living in Costa Mesa, California. And this is where Sharri stayed for 22 days. James said that he did board up the windows because Sharri asked him to. And then he also said that Sharri asked him to beat the shit out of her. Between Sharri and James, those two caused every single one of her injuries. Sharri had some kind of rash that investigators thought was from wearing the same filthy clothes over and over. But come to find out, James said that Sharri had gotten this rash when she was using cleaning fluid, scraping up every single trace of her DNA in his apartment before she went back. James said that she got a fractured nose by running face first into one of his hockey sticks. James insisted that he never used his fists on her, but at one point Sharri did ask him to knock hockey pucks off of her body. He did do that. When investigators asked James about the branding, he stated that they bought a wood burning tool and that Sharri had picked out all of the letters. He had no idea what they meant, and that this part of the process really scared him. Faking a kidnapping didn't scare him, but this process really scared him. He basically did whatever crazy thing Sharri asked him to do for those 22 days while she sat in a bedroom withering away and intentionally withholding food from herself so that she could drop weight. And then every now and then she would require him to help her make more bruises so that the bruises could be at different stages in the healing process. After the 22 days, Sharri came to James and said that she couldn't take it anymore and that she missed her children and she wanted to go home. This confused James a little bit because he thought that they were going to be together, so her going home was not a part of the plan, but he really didn't resist her on anything. He just said okay. Before taking Sharri back, James headed to Ace Hardware where he was to pick up certain items that Sharri said she would need just to reappear. Sharri asked for chains, locks, and zip ties. And then Sharri again got into the backseat of his rental car and made the long drive back toward Redding, California. Sharri had them throw those prepaid phones out of the window, and when they reached Yolo County, Sharri asked James to pull over. When he did, she hopped out of the car and just ran off into the night. She didn't even say goodbye to him. He was so shocked that she just ran off like that, but he was like, okay, and then just turn around and drove back home. That's when the call started coming into 911 about a woman on the side of the road in chains. So investigators laid all of this out for Sharri, and then they told Sharri that they knew that James was telling the truth because they gave him a lie detector test and he passed. They also brought to her attention that although she said that she had not talked to James before her kidnapping, that they could prove that that was a lie. Sharri had no real response other than to look at Keith and say, "I think we need my lawyer now." And Keith is looking at her in pure disgust, like she is the scum of the earth. He is having this epiphany too. At one point, he stepped out into the hall. He needed a break. He needed to get away. And one of the investigators stepped out with him. And that investigator returned, but Keith never came back. The investigators put a lot of pressure on Sharri to explain why she did this, why she left. They knew that she left voluntarily, but they wanted to know why. They asked her point blank, "Was Keith abusing you?" They told her, "We saw in text that you said Keith had broke your jaw. Was that true?" Sharri said no. They asked, "Was he abusing you?" Sharri also said no. Surprisingly, investigators did not have enough at the time to arrest Sharri. They couldn't exactly prove that she told James to do all the things that he said. So they continued to collect evidence, but they let her walk in the meantime. On March 3rd, 2022, 5 years after her kidnapping, Sahrri Papini was arrested and charged with federal fraud. She was also charged with mail fraud for collecting over $30,000 from the state that is designed for actual victims. And she was facing up to 20 years in prison for all of this. These were very serious charges, but Sharri did bond out like the very next day. And that day is the day that Keith Papini knew 100% that his wife was guilty. She asked him to meet her at his aunt's house, where she tried to seduce him while telling him that she wanted to take a plea deal. So he's telling her, no, why would you do this if you were actually kidnapped? And she's so nonchalant about it, and she's like, it's just a few months in an ankle bracelet. Like, it doesn't really matter. It's fine. And if that didn't seal the deal for him, her lawyer actually confirmed that she did admit to everything that was in the plea deal. I mean, the fact that she wants to take a plea deal speaks for itself, because no real victim would ever be okay with being charged with felonies after being kidnapped and tortured. Sahrri Papini was sentenced to 18 months in prison for her tremendous lies. Poor Keith had to sit and reconcile with the fact that his wife voluntarily ran away and then watched him and his family cry and mourn for her on national TV while she sat in her ex-boyfriend's bedroom watching from her phone. He obviously loved her and he thought what they had was a beautiful thing, but everyone has their breaking point, and his final breaking point happened when Sharri was already in prison. Keith was putting his daughter to bed and he was a little sore, so as he was getting up, he made that sound we make when we're so sore from working out the next day, and he kind of like painfully got up. And his daughter said to him, "Why don't you inhale some rubbing alcohol like mommy does?" And his daughter told him that when they were sick, mommy would douse a paper towel or a wash rag with rubbing alcohol. Then she would put it in a Ziploc bag and tie it around their necks so that they could constantly be inhaling it to make them feel better. The kids had no idea that she was the one making them sick, and then she would rush them off to the hospital and say she didn't know what was going on. It's so unfortunate to me that he didn't know until she was already in prison, and it's also unfortunate that she didn't really get punished for this at all. Not only did she not get punished, she was let out 6 months early. She appeared very happy, posting pictures of her smiling and dancing and just looking like she's loving life, stating that she was deeply ashamed for what she did while appearing to not be deeply ashamed at all. She was released from that halfway house in October of 2023. Wow. Can you believe her? Not only can I not believe her, I can't believe her sentence, and I cannot believe that she was let out early. Like, what is this? You guys let me know what you think in the comments about Sahrri Papini. I really just don't think she was punished the way that she should have been. She got out 6 months early, was transferred to a halfway house, and if you have time, go online and look at the pictures and just see how happy she is. She does not feel remorse. I refuse to believe that. I think it's sick what she did to her children, and I think it's sick how she was watching from her phone, and the fact that she had all of her friends recount the trauma of like her being kidnapped, and she wanted to relive with them how they reacted to figuring out she was alive. She was sick. Something's wrong with her. I hope she got therapy. Let me know what you think in the comments. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you down another rabbit hole. In 2020, a viral Facebook post was shared, and it caused the immediate outrage of the community in Cumbria, England. The post read, "I think this is the hardest post I'm ever going to have to write. Yesterday, I was put into the back of a car and taken to have sex with 2 Asian men. Afterward, I was beaten to teach me a lesson." With this post were gruesome pictures of blood and bruises and cuts, the word rat carved into her stomach, and a terrible black eye. The photos were so disturbing that they immediately got the attention of police and social media. This post was viewed over 100,000 times, and when police read through the accusations of sex trafficking, assault, and abuse, they jumped immediately into action. But as the case began to unravel, they soon found out that their 20-year-old victim was actually the villain in this story. This is the story of Elanore Williams. Hi, my name is Tasha, and this is my series White Rabbit, the podcast version, where we talk about anything spooky, odd, or just interesting. If you like this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps me out so much. If not, I appreciate you just being here. Please stay. If you're not new here, then you know this is a different background. It's not gonna be my permanent background, but my girlfriend is like doing a really cute background for me. But I think I'm gonna like switch up where I film. Not all the time, but just like here and there until I have like a permanent spot that it's like, that's my filming area. I don't know. Let me know what you think. Do you like this vibe? I think it's so cute, especially with like the different color light. Anyway, I like it. Okay, I really want to jump straight into this story because if you do not know the story of Elanore Williams, prepare to be enraged. I am enraged. No, seriously, it's enraging, so be warned. Okay, so let's get into the history of Elanore. Elanore Williams was born November 26 in the year 2000 in Cumbria, England. Fun fact, her birthday is 2 days before mine. Not super proud she's a fellow Sagittarius, but you know, you win some, you lose some. Her parents are Allison Johnston and Peter Williams. They ended up divorcing when Ellie was really young, so Ellie actually grew up in the home with her mother, her stepfather, her sister, and her brother. Ellie's mother was described as like this pillar of the community. She was a labor counselor. Okay, so I believe these are elected officials, and they're supposed to represent like the interest of the community. So they try to get laws changed or bills passed that are supposed to be to the benefit of the community. What type of laws and bills they get passed, like, I don't know. What I'm trying to get at is that as an elected official that really worked in the community, Allison and her family ended up being very well known. As a teenager, Ellie was often described as really quiet. Now, that didn't mean she was a bookworm. She was not a bookworm, but she was just more interested in social activities, and she didn't really participate in school that much. She was more of a party girl than like a serious student, but it wasn't to the point that it concerned anybody. It was like normal teenager. That was until a 16-year-old Ellie showed up to the hospital with her mother to report a sexual assault in November of 2017. According to Ellie, she had gone to a small get-together at the house of a friend of hers named Cameron. After some time of drinking and smoking weed, Ellie started to feel really sick. Cameron, while she was obviously ill, tried to kiss her, and it made her really uncomfortable, so she excused herself, got up, made an excuse to go to the restroom. Cameron followed her into the restroom where he sat on top of her and started pulling her clothes down. At some point, he dragged her out and continued to assault her in front of people while they just laughed at her. Ellie said, quote, It was horrible and I thought I was gonna die. When Cameron was approached by the police, he completely denied everything. He straight up said that Ellie was lying. He said that Ellie did come over to a gathering at his house, but she got so belligerently drunk that he called her sister because he was actually worried about her driving home. Cameron was arrested and he was charged with assault, but he was released on bail pending investigation. And during this time, Ellie ended up dropping all charges. I don't know why she did, but she just dropped all charges against him. Even though Ellie had dropped all the charges against him, police still watched and followed him for like 6 months because they just didn't trust that he wouldn't do this to someone else, and they were really worried. Ellie spent the next 2 years arguing with her mother and stepfather until she was finally fed up, and at the age of 19, she moved out into her own flat or apartment. And it was from this very apartment that police would get another phone call from Ellie Williams. Ellie can be heard on a police recording saying, "He won't get out of my flat." When the officer asked what happened that she wants this person to get out of her flat, Ellie said, "He smacked me." On March 8th, 2019, Ellie went for a night out with some of her friends, including Jordan Trentgrove. While she was on this night out, Ellie got very intoxicated and it was obvious that she needed help getting home, so Jordan took her. Ellie confided in one of her friends that Jordan had taken her somewhere she didn't know and had sexually assaulted her. The next morning, he even sent her Snapchats basically poking fun at what he had done to her. Ellie even showed her friend screenshots. So this friend ended up reporting Jordan and he was arrested, but he ended up getting let go pretty quickly because he had a very solid alibi. When I say pretty solid, I mean like ironclad. So Jordan tells the police that he doesn't even really know Ellie. He had met her a few nights ago on a night out with his friends, but Ellie had disappeared like halfway through the night. He ends up meeting up with this other girl who he hung out with for the rest of the night. They even went home together. To add to that, Jordan ended up getting into some kind of altercation with the taxi driver and he was escorted home by the police with this girl. He denied sending those Snapchats and seemed really confused by the situation, so that's pretty much how he ended up getting out on bail. And it wasn't even that police believed he was innocent, it's just that everything he was telling them was checking out, but they still believed that something had happened to Ellie. So Jordan gets released. Just a few days after Jordan's release was when Ellie made that terrified phone call to police saying that someone wouldn't leave her flat. This was Ellie's account of events. After Jordan's release, he made his way to Ellie's flat where it wasn't really clear to me if she let him in or if he forced his way in, but either way, they got into this altercation and she asked him to leave and he would not leave. Eventually, it got so bad that he dragged her by her hair into the bathroom, ripped the shower head off of the wall, and beat her face in with it. He then again sexually assaults her. When police arrived to Ellie's flat, her injuries are horrendous. She was bruised, her face was swollen, one of her eyes was almost completely swollen shut. And police were horrified because they had released Jordan thinking that he would not be a threat to her and that she would be fine. Now here he was let out on bail and he had brutally attacked her days after being let out. And somebody willing to do this while there's an open investigation on them is like so scary to the police. They were so worried about Ellie. Jordan was immediately arrested and he was held in the sex offenders wing while he awaited trial. During this time, Ellie was reported missing by her family. Now, this wasn't anything new. It seemed like for a really extended period of time, Ellie went missing like every single month and her family would report this. Her family would call the police to make a report because obviously they were worried about her. She was in such a fragile state. Normally it wouldn't take long for the police to locate her. Ellie was typically somewhere wandering, half naked, intoxicated. They found her passed out in fields before. But this time Ellie was a little harder to locate and her family was really worried because she had had a history of self-harm and there was so much going on in her life at this time. They just didn't want her to hurt herself. Also at this time, she was suspected of using drugs, specifically cocaine, so they were also afraid that she was somewhere ODing. Now, a month later, Ellie just pops back up. And she had developed a really close relationship to one of the officers that she was working with. And they were sitting down having a talk, and Ellie was kind of telling her why she was spiraling so much, why she kept disappearing, why she was doing drugs. And she revealed to this officer that she had been sex trafficked since the age of 12 or 13. Ellie says that she was young and dumb, and at 12 and 13, she was hanging out at parties with much older men. One of these older men was Mohammed Ramson, or Rami as she called him. Mohammed was a 40-year-old married businessman, and he was the father of 4. Ellie claimed that she was groomed into having sex with him. She said that for a very long time, she was made to actually believe that she was his girlfriend, and then she had sex with him. He asked her to have sex with one of his friends, and so she did that, wanting to please him, and that soon turned into her being driven all over, sometimes 9 to 10 hours away from her home, to have sex with older men. And she later found out that he was actually making money off of her, none of which she ever saw. And not only that, Ellie gave officers a list of about 50 girls who had gone through the exact same thing. Ellie described this as no small operation. This was a huge ring where she and the other girls were basically auctioned off to the highest bidders. And Ellie name dropped multiple community men to the police as participants. Not only that, she also had Snapchats proving that they had had sexual relationships with her while she was a minor. Mohammed was arrested and questioned. He firmly denied the allegations, and according to him, he didn't even know who Ellie was. He had never spent any time alone with her. In spite of all the detail Ellie went into, Mohammed was released because the police didn't have anything to really hold him on. And when I say detail, I mean Ellie went into details. Ellie said that she was driven to Blackpool by Mohammed, where she was passed off to man after man against her will. She remembered things like the streets, addresses, smells, if someone had wallpaper, if there was a calendar on their wall. She knew so much detail. Mohammed said everything was a lie, and the police couldn't prove one way or another what really happened. So they called in for outside help, and Mohammed was released back into the community. Ellie was then put into a hotel near the police station for protection. Pretty much everyone was afraid for her life because she was helping to break up this massive trafficking ring, so obviously there would be a target on her back. So officers decided to take Ellie back to Blackpool so that she could point out all of these places that she had been. But once they got there, there was like a change in Ellie. Like all of a sudden she didn't know anything. The same woman that was going into detail after detail at the police station remembered next to nothing when they were actually there. They spent 2 days riding around and she recalled nothing. So the officers decide to take another approach, and they start to go to all the hotels in the area, and they were showing Ellie's picture, asking if anyone recognized her. They finally caught a break when an employee at the Savoy Hotel recognized Ellie and remembered her checking in. She had reserved the night of June 30th, 2 days earlier online, and Ellie checked in at 8 p.m. 8:30 p.m. So this is the same day that Ellie said she was forcibly driven around town, passed off to man after man by Mohammed. And the hotel security footage showed Ellie checking in, and get this, she was alone. So then officers started pulling CCTV footage tracing back to when Ellie first arrived in Blackpool. And what the CCTV footage shows is 100% different from the story Ellie was telling. First, Ellie was spotted arriving at the train station alone. Of course, they had her checking into the Savoy alone. Then she was spotted at some local shops buying snacks and treats. She arrived back to the hotel alone. And not only that, they looked at her key card, and when she got into her room, she did not leave the room for the entire night. The door was never opened again. Her phone showed that she was in that hotel room the entire time streaming movies and shows during the time where she supposedly was being driven all over town past amongst men. Men that she was name dropping. Oh, and then they have footage of her returning home, and again, she was alone. She took the bus this time by herself. Not only that, police had been tracking down the girls on that list that Ellie had given them. It was like 50 names of other girls who were victims. And every single one of those girls that they came across had no idea what Ellie was talking about. Some of them hadn't even seen her since high school, and they had no idea why she told the police that. So did she not think the police were going to confirm with other victims? Like, she gave actual names of people that knew her and said that they were abused. She needs help, honestly. She needs help. She needs a lot of help. Come to find out, every single place that Ellie said Muhammad had taken her, either the police could prove that Ellie was there alone, or they could prove that Muhammad was in a completely different area at the time. And then there's the Snapchats, the proof that Ellie was having relationships with all of these older men when she was underage. Well, surprise, surprise, all of the Snapchats were fake. Ellie sent them to herself. She created another Snapchat, sent them to herself, and she would like finesse the names and numbers. I don't know. You know what else was fake? That whole situation with Jordan when he got released on bail and came and attacked her again. Police ended up digging as deep as they should have dug the first time around, and they proved his innocence. He was still in jail in the sex offenders unit waiting for his trial. And while investigators are now investigating her, she is still making more assault claims. In July of 2019, Ellie called police stating she had just been attacked and sexually assaulted by another one of the men in this trafficking ring. Police arrived to a battered, bloody, and clearly intoxicated Ellie Williams. But CCTV footage proved that this man Ellie was accusing of attacking her had met her at random along the street. She gave him a lighter and they strolled off hand in hand, laughing, ducked down an alleyway to have what he said was consensual sex. And when they came back out of the alleyway, Ellie was smiling and laughing, and she seemed like she was in no distress at all. Ellie was captured walking home with no physical bruises, no injuries whatsoever, but less than 20 minutes later, police would arrive to see a battered and bloody woman. After years of investigating this sex trafficking ring that was supposedly led by Muhammad, police came to a brutal realization. Ellie Williams was nothing but a massive liar. An expert was called in to re-examine all of the pictures of the bruises that was on Ellie throughout the different years, throughout all the reports, and it was found that the bruises were self-inflicted with Ellie's right hand. All of these men that she had accused, their lives had been ruined. Their businesses suffered, their families suffered, they were shunned from the community, and every single one of the men accused were Asian. Okay. This basically sparked a whole wave of Asian hate crimes. Businesses were vandalized, business was withheld from a lot of them. Ellie really unleashed hell on so many people's lives. I can only imagine how pissed the police were when they found out they had wasted years of their time. Ellie was arrested in 2020 for perverting the course of justice, but she was released on bail where she again disappeared. Again. In just 1 year, Ellie was reported missing over 30 times by her family. This time, Ellie was found in a field, very intoxicated, beaten to a pulp. I mean, it is hard to look at. Ellie was telling officers that she was attacked and dragged into a field by 10 You guessed it, Asian men. So Ellie was transported to the hospital and the police are in the field looking for clues. And they do find a clue. They find a hammer. And this hammer is covered in blood, so they send it off for testing. This is when Ellie made that viral Facebook post telling the entire world the lies that she had been telling the police over the past few years. Without any other context, the community was outraged. They even created this huge support group for this little liar. And they were pissed when she got arrested because she did indeed get arrested. She was on bail and she disappeared. But the public could not understand why this girl who was victimized was now being arrested. But you see, testing had come back on that hammer and there was no DNA found other than Ellie's on that hammer. And there was CCTV footage of her buying the hammer. She smashed her own face in with a hammer. Elanore Williams was found guilty on 8 counts of perverting the course of justice. She was sentenced to 8.5 years. Half of that time would be served in prison and the other half of that time she would be out on license, which I'm assuming is like parole. 3 of the men that Ellie had accused of these terrible crimes were so tortured that they actually tried to end their own existence. And I'm gonna say right now that 8.5 years and only having to serve half of that time in prison is not enough time. She destroyed way too many lives. And seriously, like a little over 4 years incarcerated for what she did. I don't think that's enough, and I think she is a filthy liar that would have never stopped if she had gotten away with it. She had no care. She did not care that she was ruining these men's lives, and that's sick. And that is the story of Elanore Williams. Please tell me what you think in the comments about Miss Ellie. If you have not subscribed, please subscribe. I would love for you to join me again. And other than that, I will see you down another rabbit hole. On February 19th, 2008, 9-year-old Shannon Matthews was reported missing by her mother after never returning home from school. In response, police in West Yorkshire launched one of the largest investigations in its history. This investigation included over 250 officers, over 60 detectives, over 3,000 homes were searched, and 1,500 motorists were questioned. To top it all off, 16 victim recovery dogs were also used. 24 days after she went missing, Shannon was found alive, concealed in the base of the bed of someone very close to the investigation. This is the kidnapping story of Shannon Matthews. Hi, my name is Tasha, and this is my series White Rabbit, the podcast version, where we deep dive into anything spooky, odd, or interesting. And this case definitely delivers on odd and interesting. This was a huge case in the UK. There was so much media coverage. The family of Shannon Matthews even had a documentary film crew with them the entire last week of Shannon's disappearance. It's all on tape. I want to jump right into this video, but before I do, please remember to like, comment, subscribe if you want to see more content, if you want to see more of me. So let's start at the very beginning so I can like set the scene. The cats are grooming each other in the background, so if you hear it, I'm sorry. Shannon Louise Matthews was born September 9th, 1998. She lived in West Yorkshire with her mother, Karen, and her mother's live-in boyfriend, Craig Meehan. At the time of the events we're talking about today, 4 out of Shannon's 7 siblings were living in the house. The other 3 lived with their fathers, I believed. At the time, the family lived in a council house in a pretty impoverished area. Now, if you don't know what a council house is, it's government housing for those who can't afford to purchase a house on their own. Unfortunately, it's normally in an impoverished area, in a neighborhood where there are no jobs, high crime rate. Not always, but a lot of times. Shannon's mother didn't work. She received benefits, but her boyfriend, Craig Meehan, he worked as a fishmonger. And I had no idea what that was. I definitely had to Google. But a fishmonger is a person that sells fish to people for the purpose of food. Shannon was described as a happy girl, but she was also described as a very shy, quiet, reserved girl. She did have her circle of friends, but that's pretty much the only people that she would hang out with. For the most part, Shannon just had a normal 9-year-old life. February 19th, 2008 started out just like any other day for Shannon. She woke up, she put on her school uniform, and she headed out to school like every other day. Her school actually offered free swimming lessons, so that day her entire class went to the pool, and then after the pool they were all bussed back, I believe, to the school where their parents would either pick them up or they would walk home. Most of the time, Karen would be there to meet Shannon, but this particular day, she actually got held up at the grocery store. So Karen didn't make it home until around 4 p.m., at which point Craig told her that Shannon never came home. Karen was a little worried because Shannon had never come home late from school before. Even the neighbors said that other kids would stop off at the park or play, but Shannon would always just go straight home after school. But at the same time, Karen was telling herself, okay, she's a kid, she's 9. She probably did stop at a park or she's playing with friends somewhere. Shannon should have been home by now, but at this point, she was only about an hour and a half late. So Karen wasn't in full-blown worry mode yet. I don't know why. It was the middle of February. It was cold. It was rainy. Kidnappers. Karen went into full-blown worry when she realized not a single person had seen Shannon. That is when Karen decided it was time to call the police and report her daughter missing. The police arrived within minutes, like 3 minutes, and they were on the ground searching, talking to neighbors, but they were coming up with nothing. But that did not stop them from spending hours outside searching every possible place that Shannon could have went. Because at this time, it was a thought, or more like a hope, that Shannon had just run off. And they're thinking they just have to locate this little girl. But when morning came and there was still no trace of Shannon, it was starting to look more like an abduction. Because let's be honest, there's nowhere that a 9-year-old girl is gonna go by herself that the entire community and the police force would not be able to find her. Also, Shannon's best friend was the last person to see her that day, and she saw her walking home from school. It was super worrying that she lived less than a half a mile away in Moorside Estate, where there are tons of neighbors, there are lots of kids out, so it was so concerning that not a single person had seen Shannon since she left school. It's the dead of winter. If she went out to the park somewhere, she would be back by now. It had even started to rain and it was freezing. Shannon wouldn't just spend the night outside. Shannon's disappearance was covered the next morning on local news, urging anyone that had any information to please come forward. And the community was really involved in this. One of Karen's neighbors, Julie Bugsby, she actually stepped up and organized a search team within the neighbors. And they were looking just like the police were looking. Nobody's coming up with anything, but there are a lot of people looking. 24 hours after Shannon was reported missing, her mother Karen made her first tearful plea to the public. She appeared stressed, disheveled. She had massive bags under her eyes. I mean, Karen looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, and it had only been 24 hours. In this appearance, she just begged Shannon to please come home, and she was telling her how much everyone loved her and everyone missed her. She also used this time to plead with anybody that had Shannon to please return her safely.
Where she belongs, with the family. If anybody's got Shannon, please return her home safe. I'm begging you, baby, come home.
At this time, Craig and Karen were assigned 2 family liaison officers. So these are officers that specialize in dealing with the families involved in serious crimes. According to these family liaison officers, when they arrived, Karen did not even acknowledge them. She didn't even look up from what she was doing. And Craig was sat there next to her playing Xbox. Neighbors had flooded into the house. They were comforting Karen. They were organizing search parties. They were printing flyers. Everyone was doing something, but Karen sat there kind of disassociated in a daze, and Craig played Xbox. Officers searched the home for anything that could help them in their victimology. They wanted to really understand who Shannon was so that they could understand what moves she might make. They spent a lot of time in her room, and they even lifted prints from her room just in case they would need them in the future for comparison. The police were taking this very seriously. I mean, they meant business. They searched over 500 houses that were on the route that Shannon would have taken home from school. And that was like full searches, not just like, hi, have you seen this little girl? Have you heard anything about her? No, they were inside people's homes. Not only were they looking for Shannon, but they also were looking for any clues that a crime had been committed there. They had 16 police dogs out. Now, I had never heard of them using so many police dogs at one time on a search. I think normally there are like 2 or 4, but 16. And even with 16 police dogs, they still found nothing. One reason that this reaction was so extreme and police were taking this so seriously is because this had happened not even a full year after the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. And if you don't know about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, she was a 4-year-old little girl from the UK, but she was on vacation with her parents in Portugal when she actually went missing. This was a very highly publicized case, and there was no resolution in this. This must have felt like a recurring nightmare for the public, because when I did my little googly search, I found out that they only lived like 2 hours from each other. And this was like 9 months apart. I think it was the 4th day that Shannon was missing when her best friend went to investigators and told them that on the day of her disappearance, Shannon didn't walk home the way that she normally walked home. I think she said she walked up the road instead of down the road. Now, mind you, they searched over 500 houses in the opposite direction. But she's 9, so you get what you get. During this time, police actually asked the family and neighbors to stop searching. It became increasingly evident and more likely that if they were to find Shannon, they would probably be finding a crime scene. So they didn't want anyone other than investigators, police, law enforcement looking for Shannon. And at this point, they had over 200 officers on the case, so they had the manpower. Some of the officers began to investigate people in the neighborhood just to see if anyone got their attention, and what they discovered was sickening and terrifying. Within just 20 miles of Shannon's home, there were 1,400 registered sex offenders. Within 20 miles. Many of them living on the path that children would take to get from home to Moorside Estate. That is both scary and overwhelming. That is a massive amount of people to investigate. So there were dedicated officers that would investigate these people, interview them, either flag them or clear them. To make matters worse, there was some freaking sex offenders meeting where sex offenders were actually bussed into the area for therapy sessions. And this just so happened to be the day Shannon went missing. Like, what are really the chances? So now there were even more people to go through. It was like this never-ending list of creeps. And so many of these creeps either had ties to, knew Shannon, or lived near Shannon. And when I say so many, I mean hundreds. It was in the hundreds. And the sex offenders weren't the only ones that needed to be investigated. Family, friends, anyone that knew Shannon needed to be investigated. And police wanted to start as close to home as possible, so they started with Craig Meehan. And they didn't really have a reason to suspect Craig other than he lived in the house with Shannon and he was weird. Did I do both fingers? I don't know. Weird. And who's to say what's weird? A lot of the reasons I saw people say that he was weird was like, oh, he likes computers. Grow up. He didn't seem very smart. Well, not seeming smart doesn't like make you weird. So who knows? Maybe he was weird, maybe he wasn't weird. A lot of people also had a problem with his age because he was like 10 years younger than Karen. But I don't know, computers, IQ, and age, that doesn't like scream weird to me. People also hated that he would not give interviews. The media was like foaming at the mouth trying to get him to say something, and he just was not having it. So then they're like, you're weird. Craig didn't give any interviews until one day. There was an article released that basically alleged that he and Shannon had a very violent, volatile relationship and that he would often hit her. Very next day, he did his first interview. There was a film crew that came to his house the very next day, and he sat there with Karen, and he denied ever hitting Shannon. He said that he had never in his life put his hands on her, and Karen also backed him up. She agreed, said that he had never put his hands on her. After this initial interview, Karen went on several more interviews defending Craig, and because she was defending Craig, people started to become suspicious of her. And when you become suspicious of somebody, what do? You naturally dig into all of their business. So that is what they did. They wanted all the details about her life. One thing that was given a lot of attention, in my opinion, a little too much attention, was the fact that she had had 7 children by 5 fathers, and she wasn't with any of them anymore. She had moved this new boyfriend who was 10 years younger into the house with her instead of being with the father of any of her children. They portrayed her as living this very immoral life. For lack of a better term, they were just very judgy about her lifestyle. And Karen gives you a lot of ammo to be judgy on her. Like, you could pick so many other things. Like, for instance, the fact that she was the estate's party house, and after Shannon went missing, she never stopped the parties. Karen continued to have all of these people around her other children while not even knowing where Shannon is or who took her. Every night you would hear music coming from her house like her daughter wasn't even missing. No idea who took Shannon, but still bringing all of these people around your other children. That is suspicious. It's strange at the very least, And another strange thing that Karen did was during a press conference, she stated that it was her belief that Shannon was taken by someone that she knew and someone that Shannon knew. And she also stated that she just couldn't trust anyone anymore. And the first time you shared this information is at a press conference. She seemed to really like the fact that the cameras were there, never mind the reason they were actually there. But even her family and close friends noticed that she would kind of turn it on for the cameras, and then as soon as the cameras were gone, she would just like turn it off again and go back into this nonchalant, not even care type mode. There was even one story that her neighbor shared about them going to a sandwich shop. Okay, so Karen and her neighbor went to this sandwich shop, and when the owner seen who it was that had ordered the food, he told her, "It's on me, don't worry about it, you don't have to pay for your meal." Karen turns around to her neighbor, smiles, and says, "Maybe more of my children should go missing." Or maybe it was "my children should go missing more often." But either way, what the fuck? Like, how can you make a joke like that when your daughter is still missing? But people close to Karen said that she never seemed worried that Shannon would end up dead. She just was so sure that she was okay. She was very confident that Shannon was still alive. Even when her neighbors would try to tell her, prep her, "Hey, have you ever thought about what you would do or how you would react if she is hurt, if she is dead?" And supposedly she wouldn't even entertain the idea. She was just like, no, Shannon's fine. She's coming home. She's fine. Also suspicious. The family liaison officer actually reported back saying that she was kind of worried because Karen was showing a complete lack of concern for her daughter. The media coverage on Shannon's disappearance at this point had really started to die down, but the Sun newspaper ended up offering a reward of £50,000. The community was pretty upset actually about the media coverage dying down because Madeleine McCann had been missing for longer and she still had tons of coverage. The general consensus is that this was a class issue, but people also said really mean things while trying to advocate for Shannon. They were saying that this was basically because Madeleine was cute and Shannon was not, and Madeleine was thin and Shannon was not, and Madeleine's family had money and Shannon's were poor. Don't advocate for her by calling her ugly. She's 9. When Karen was asked how she felt about the McCanns, seeing as how they were in a similar situation, her response was actually crazy. Karen said, "We are nothing like them. They have money, they're celebrities," and then she called them snobs. You all live 2 hours away and both of your daughters went missing. And you're calling them snobs just because they have money? She had never even met them. Just no sense of sympathy for another mother who had also lost her daughter. And that wasn't even the worst part. Someone, we don't know who, we never found out who, but the call came from inside the house. Someone called the McCanns asking for money, telling them basically that Shannon is just as important as your daughter and we should have financial backing just like you do. I mean, it's true, Shannon is just as important as Madeline, but how are you gonna call me a snob and then the very same night call me and ask me for money? They weren't funded, that was their money. You're not entitled to someone else's money just because your daughter is also missing. The McCanns did not offer them any money, but what they did do is they called investigators to let them know that something weird was going on. Police finally catch a break when someone calls in and tells them that they need to take a look into a guy named Paul Drake, also known as Michael Donovan. He had actually changed his name to Michael Donovan, so I'm just gonna call him Michael Donovan for the rest of the video. Okay, so Michael Donovan is Craig Meehan's uncle. And this man said that Michael Donovan would come see him every single day, but since Shannon went missing, that he has not seen him a single time. Also, he said that one time he saw Shannon sitting on Michael's lap and it was like super inappropriate and it made him uncomfortable. Not uncomfortable enough to do anything. All he did was make a mental note, but at least he did that. He also supplied them with Michael Donovan's address, which ended up being only a mile from Karen's house. Officers headed over there immediately. When they arrived, they knocked for quite a while, but no one ever came to the door and the house was really, really quiet. So officers used this as an opportunity to talk to some of the neighbors and see if they could get any more information. And in talking to the neighbors, they found out that Michael would not answer his door to anyone. So even if he was home and they were knocking, he was not going to let them in. Michael's downstairs neighbor also told police that she would hear 2 sets of footsteps, and one of the footsteps sounded like it was really light, like the footsteps of a child. Officers decided right then and there with that information that they were going to go in, and they did. First, the house was dead silent. But then in one of the bedrooms, one of the officers heard a really soft child voice say, quote, "Stop it, you're frightening me." 24 days after being reported missing, Shannon Matthews was found in the base of the bed of Michael Donovan. Michael was also hiding under the bed and he was quickly taken away, arrested for child abduction. Shannon was then taken to the police station where she was put into a room with a 2-way mirror and pretty much nothing else. Karen was brought into the opposite side to be able to identify her, but she was allowed no contact. And Karen's reaction to seeing Shannon was no reaction at all. She didn't seem to care. She didn't ask if she could hug her or why she had to be in this separate room. There was a reason. They didn't want any evidence that was on Shannon to be contaminated, but Karen never even asked. She didn't ask if Shannon had been hurt or where she was all of this time. When asked if the little girl was Shannon, she simply said yes. Suspicious. 24 days missing and you don't have a single question about your daughter. While Karen was identifying Shannon, Michael was being interrogated at a different police station and he was doing all of the talking. He was doing enough for both of them. In fact, he started snitching before his butt cheeks even hit the seat. And he told officers that Karen Matthews was behind everything. So let's talk about Michael. And there's not much, I promise. Michael Donovan was very much a loner. He lived alone. He had no friends. He didn't talk to his neighbors. All the neighbors could tell investigators about Michael was that he really loved his car and he spent most of his time washing it and working on it. It was just very obvious that his car was his baby. Michael did have some mental issues. He had a really bad car accident where he suffered some brain damage. He could still live a normal life and everything, but his brain just didn't operate the same way it did before the accident. Okay, so before Shannon disappeared, now the timeline is a little sketchy on here because I read some reports that said this happened like a year before Shannon disappeared, and then I read some reports saying that this happened a few months before Shannon disappeared, so don't hold me on the timeline. But the event. Okay, so at some point before Shannon disappeared, Michael had went to a family funeral. At this funeral is where Michael met Karen. And apparently the two really hit it off. Not only did Michael hit it off with Karen, but Michael hit it off with Shannon. And at some point he was seen bouncing her on his knee and being very touchy-feely. This is the same event that the person that called in the tip about him was talking about. This is the same time. So while Michael was being very creepy, gross old man with Shannon, Shannon didn't seem uncomfortable, but she was only 8. She was probably oblivious to what was going on. But so many adults that were at that same funeral say that they vividly remembered this and it was like wildly inappropriate to them. But who it wasn't inappropriate to was Karen, because Karen was sitting right there watching all of this happen and she did not seem to mind. So that was when they met. Now, so Michael says that he is the one that picked up Shannon from school and he picked her up on Karen's orders. He said that Karen had come to him with this plan to fake Shannon's abduction and that if he did not help her, that she would get 2 men to beat him up. So basically he's saying that he agreed out of fear. So this is what was supposed to happen. Michael would go pick up Shannon from school and just keep her and look after her while Karen reported Shannon missing. They figured at some point there would be this really big reward for Shannon's safe return, at which point Michael would take Shannon somewhere where they could be spotted by CCTV and pretend to find her like wandering. He would get the reward and then they would split it. And a 50,000 pound reward was put up by the son, so I don't know if he was just waiting for Karen's go ahead, but either way they never made it to that part. And this part is the part that's just crazy to me, because when Shannon returns and she talks to the police, do you not think that the police would be able to break this 9-year-old girl? Did they think it was enough to just tell this little girl like, hey, don't tell the police who actually took you? Michael made it a point to talk about how good he treated Shannon. He said that he bought her new clothes, he took her to the park at night so she could get energy out, and that he never once harmed her. I guess kidnapping doesn't constitute as harm to him, but okay. When investigators searched his flat, they found this weird long elastic leash that would basically reach to the bathroom, to the television, but not to the front door. Michael said that he never used this on Shannon, that she was allowed to walk around the flat freely, but why would it be there? It was also never proved because there was none of Shannon's DNA on it, but it's just weird. Suspicious. There was a list of handwritten rules hung up in the flat, mostly about Shannon staying quiet and staying hidden, and she had to sign like a promise on the end of it that she would keep these rules. There were also a lot of pills and a lot of pill casings. They were everywhere. Now the bed was the most interesting thing, because the bed converted into a hiding space for the two of them, and this shows that there was actually a lot of planning that went into this. He was very prepared for her to be there, and he was also very prepared for the fact that he might have to hide her at some point. They might get caught. So the investigators are taking all of this in, and of course they go to Karen with this information, with these accusations, which she completely denies. And they actually have no real proof that she was involved with this at all. So they had to let Karen go while they built a case. A few days after Shannon's rescue, there was this big reunion planned. It was filmed and everything, and it was between Shannon and Karen, because Shannon still wasn't home at this point. So when Shannon sees her mom, she is so happy and so excited. She runs up to her, throws her arms around her, "Mommy, mommy, mommy," and basically Karen pushed her away, walked over to the family liaison officers, and just sat next to them on the couch. The family liaison officers had to tell Karen, go play with Shannon, go talk to your daughter, go ask her anything, like any kind of interaction with your daughter. So she did after she was prompted, but quickly after that, Karen started doing things like checking her watch, putting her coat on, just making it very clear that she was ready to go. Now, there were a lot of people suspicious of Karen, and 2 of these people were actually Karen's best friends. Natalie and Julie were pretty much suspicious of Karen from the very beginning. Things just did not make sense to them. And at this point in the investigation, they really wanted answers. Natalie at one point told Karen, "You can trust me, you can tell me. I know you're hiding something." And Karen's response to her was, "I can't tell anybody what I'm hiding." Suspicious. So then Natalie says, "Let me tell you what I think happened, okay?" And she throws this story out. "I think you and Craig were in another bad patch, and I think you were gonna leave him. I think Michael offered you a place to stay with the kids, and I think he even offered to pick up Shannon from school that day. I think you were supposed to go home and get the rest of the children, but when you got there and Craig was there panicking about Shannon not being home, you didn't know what to do." Now, she said that little piece because it was a known fact that Craig was supposed to be at work that day, but he actually ended up getting sick, so he didn't go in. So Natalie is basically saying when Karen got there and saw Craig still there, she for some reason just went along with everything that he was saying and just let him call the police and think that Shannon was missing because she didn't want to tell him that she was leaving him. So Natalie puts out this theory, and then Karen turns to her and says, yeah, that's the truth." Karen's ass got arrested and taken in for interrogation because what do you mean? She admitted that she did indeed ask Michael to, quote, take Shannon for a little while. She said that this was just because she wanted to leave Craig, and this had nothing whatsoever to do with reward money. Even though Michael had already told the investigators the plan from the beginning was to get the reward money.
To make it look like she was genuinely missing.
Yeah.
When you really knew that she wasn't genuinely missing. Is that right?
Yeah.
So then the police have come to your house, have they?
Yeah.
And what have you told the police?
I've told them what she was wearing and stuff like that.
Karen and Michael were both charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and perverting the course of justice. Michael Donovan was evaluated by a psychologist where he was found to be a very vulnerable person who would pretty much do anything you told him to. While he was in prison, guards even caught him washing his cellmate's feet, and when he was asked why he was doing that, he just said, "He asked me to." Don't wash the feet. Do not wash the feet. They immediately moved his cell, and psychologists really felt like he was too vulnerable to be in the regular prison system. They wanted him to be admitted into a psychiatric hospital. It came out during the trial how much Shannon was actually drugged, and she was kept sedated. They had given her travel sickness pills because they caused drowsiness. They also would give her sleeping pills. Temazepam was found in her hair sample, and this actually showed that she was being drugged 2 years before her abduction. So I wonder if Karen supplied Michael with all of these drugs because she knew that these were the ones that worked. Michael said that he only used these when Shannon started to get really stir crazy and she just wanted to get outside. Karen and Michael were both sentenced to 8 years in prison, and both of them only served half of that time before their release. Shortly after his release, Michael was seen acting very strange in public. I don't know what he was doing, but he ended up going to a psychiatric hospital and he never left. He died there. He died from throat cancer in a West Yorkshire hospital in April of 2024. Karen Matthews was granted a new identity, which apparently she is not good at keeping up with because she is not at all anonymous. She lives in England with her new boyfriend, Paul. As for Shannon and all of her siblings were taken away and put into the foster care system. Shannon was given a new identity and her siblings were given complete anonymity, meaning that their names can never be released. In my opinion, Karen and Michael definitely both needed psychiatric help because this was a stupid plan. It was so stupid, it was never gonna work. Part of me felt like maybe Karen was just so desperate for money, but the way she treated her daughter and how she wasn't even excited when she got to come back, I just don't think she cared for her. The money wasn't even a guarantee. What if nobody put up reward money? Was she just gonna leave her there? Was she just gonna give her away to him? Plus, she was drugging Shannon for like 2 years straight, so I don't believe it was out of desperation for money. But enough of my thoughts. Tell me what you think in the comments. Give me all the juicy details. What do you think of this case? Please remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and I will see you down another rabbit hole. I think the baby wasn't feeling well.